Hey y'all, I'm Hope, and today I want to recommend some spooky books that I think would be great to pick up for spooky season this year. Now I know that this video is going to be going up kind of mid-October, so a lot of us are probably already well into our spooky book TBRs for the year, but I wanted to give some recommendations that might be fun as kind of last-minute books to slip in here at the end of the month. So I want to start with two books that are favorites of mine that were very popular on BookTube about 2 years ago and are the books that I kind of credit with getting me interested in horror as a genre. So the first one of these is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This follows 4 Native American men who are being hunted by a vengeful entity 10 years after a hunting trip gone wrong. This book is super scary. It was one of those where I would say, oh, it's not that scary when I was reading it, but at the same time, I didn't want to sleep with this book in my room at night. I'd go put it in my office so that it wasn't around me. So it's that kind of it's not scary when the lights are on, but then it gets dark and you're like, oh shit. And this is also a book that I think about weekly, at least, since I read it 2 years ago. I think about this book all the time. I think it's got some brilliant themes in it. Particularly, there's this theme of cycles of violence, and I really like the way that this book ends, kind of within that theme. And I also love the way that Stephen Graham Jones writes characters. I feel like all of the characters in this book feel like real people. And so they're all people that you feel like you can really kind of get behind and root for, which makes all of the horror elements that much more devastating. And so I really love everything about this book. I still think about it all the time, and I think more people should read it if they haven't. So The Only Good Indians is, I feel like, a good first recommendation here, and it's not terribly long. So I think I read this in 2 or 3 days, so it'd be a good one to kind of slip in here at the end. The other book that I kind of credit with getting me into horror here is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a Gothic story, as the title would suggest, about a woman named Noemi who gets a letter from her cousin, and the cousin's just married this guy and gone off to live on his family estate, and the cousin sends Noemi this letter that's my husband is trying to kill me, I need your help. And so Noemi travels to this distant country estate to try and figure out what's going on, and it's very clear very early on that there is something very wrong with the family there, and Noemi sticks around to try and figure out what's going on and save her cousin. I really like Noemi as a protagonist. She makes a lot of mistakes, but they're really interesting mistakes, and I really like the way that her love for her cousin and her desire to figure out what's going on really drove her throughout the story. I think she's a really fun protagonist to follow. There's a lot of really creepy moments in this book that I still think about regularly, similarly to The Only Good Indians. Part of why I love this book so much is it's really stuck with me, and I think that if you've been hearing a lot of people saying this book is great, you should listen to them and try it, because I think it is great. And it's also just very atmospheric and a great book to get you in the spooky season mood, I think. So next I have a few more recent favorites. Some of these are a little less on the horror side, but they are spooky kind of in general. But these are books that I've read in the last year and really loved. So the first one of these is Sorrowland by River Solomon. This is a very difficult book in a lot of ways, so I highly recommend you look up content warnings for this book. The ones I can think of off the top of my head have to do with medical experimentation, pregnancy, childbirth, forced marriage, a lot of body horror. Yeah, so that's just what I can remember off the top of my head, but I highly recommend looking up some content warnings for this book if you're thinking of picking it up, and if any of those things you think would kind of disturb you. But this book follows Vern, who's a young woman who escapes from a religious compound and gives birth in the woods, and proceeds to raise her children in the woods. And as she's raising her children, her body starts to undergo a lot of very odd changes, and it sends her kind of on this quest to figure out what happened to her and why this is happening, and to try and kind of reckon with her past so that she can make a better future for her children. I loved everything about this story. Vern is a really interesting protagonist. She's very abrasive and mean and aggressive, but also nurturing and compassionate, and I just liked the way that she got to have a lot of very different traits and be a really well-rounded person. I also love the support network that Vern builds throughout this story, so she meets more and more people who kind of support her, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And also the writing in here is just lovely. River Solomon writing is fantastic. This next book is a little more on the literary side, but I did just read it for a class. This is Outer Dark by Cormac McCarthy. This is the first thing I've ever read from Cormac McCarthy, and I definitely want to pick up more of his books because I was really pleasantly surprised that I really enjoyed this book. It's a very strange little book, but I think the writing is interesting. There's no quotation marks, which takes a little bit of adjustment, but I think that you can adjust in the first few pages, at least I did, and it gets really interesting from there. But there's this kind of apocalyptic aspect of it that lends some creepiness to it, and there's also a lot of like creepy atmosphere and like spooky things happening. But this follows these two siblings, Culla and Arinthi, and Arinthi is giving birth to Culla's child at the beginning of the book, and Culla puts the baby in the woods and tells Arinthi that the baby has died, but Arinthi realizes he's lying and goes on this quest to find the baby. And then Culla goes on a quest to find Arinthi. And while they're kind of going on their separate travels, there's also three mysterious strangers who are wreaking havoc through the countryside. Next I have What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. I read this one about a month or so ago, and I absolutely loved it. This is a brilliant retelling of Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, and I think this one's interesting because it gives us like an explanation for the horror, but that never detracts from how scary the things happening are. So I think that that was interesting that we got the explanation and it didn't like, you know, take away from the horror. I also think this book has a really interesting blend of horror and humor. This book is very funny. There are a lot of really quirky characters and funny dialogue, but also body horror. Like lots of body horror. Next couple of things are also retellings. The first one, actually they're both by the same author too. So the first one is The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle, which is a great retelling of H.P. Lovecraft's The Horror at Red Hook. This one follows Tom, who's a musician, and he's trying to basically make enough money to scrape by and take care of himself and his father, and then he ends up taking this job delivering a weird book to a weird woman, and things kind of kick off from there. I don't want to tell you too much beyond that, because it is a very short book, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody who wants to read it, because I think it has some really great reveals, but this book is incredibly creepy, and also has a really freaky ending that still kind of freaks me out, so I really highly recommend this one. And I also think this does an interesting job, or not an interesting job, it does a good job of this interesting thing where it is recentering the marginalized people that were often kind of the horror or in the margins of Lovecraft's original work. So it kind of recenters people of color in a really interesting way, and I think that the writing in here is also just really fun to read. So the other one is also Victor LaValle, and this is Destroyer. This is a graphic novel. One of the only graphic novels I've ever really loved, but this one is a retelling of Frankenstein, and I think it's a really good one. This one kind of likewise recenters people of color in the story, and I think it does some really interesting things tackling kind of modern issues, particularly around like police brutality. But I think this is really brilliantly written, and I love the experience of reading this book. I think that the story is really good. This one made me cry. Yeah, I don't know what else to say here because again, it's very short and I don't want to spoil it for you, but I do think this book has some really interesting stuff that it does with like themes around family as well that I really enjoyed, and I think that if you're going to read like any graphic novel, you should definitely consider picking this one up because the artwork is also just like beautiful, and I've just turned to a page that has a chicken on it. I don't remember what the chicken is about, but like look at this beautifully drawn chicken. So the next two I have are books by one of my favorite authors. I think he's a little underrated. I never see anyone talk about him on BookTube, but I really enjoy all of his books. I've read a pretty good chunk of his backlist, not all of it, but I really enjoy his writing and I love the way he writes characters, so I wanted to recommend a couple of his books. So the first one is the more strictly horror book, which is In the Shadow of the Axe. It's by Nicholas Kaufman. And this follows a guy named Kosh. I think I'm probably mispronouncing that. It's German and I'm bad at German, but it's set in Germany in the 1840s, and it follows Kosh as he returns home after having been away at boarding school for a few years, and upon his arrival back in his village, he finds out that his father has died and he has to kind of figure out what to do with the house and everything. A lot of this book is about Kosh and how he does not or did not have a good relationship with his father and how strained that relationship was, and about the complication that causes for him when he returns to town because his father was like a local hero. And then on top of that kind of difficult situation, there's also this aspect of the history coming back to haunt them. The tagline is "The past leaves a long shadow and the axe has only just begun to fall." I thought this was really fun, and I highly recommend it if you want something short. This also has a short story at the back of it that was really good as well. It's called Fearless. The other book by Nicholas Kaufman I want to recommend is Chasing the Dragon. This is less on the horror side. It's actually urban fantasy with some horror elements, but this one follows Georgia, who is from a long line of dragon slayers, who now is trying to slay the dragon. That's basically the premise, and because this one's also very short, I don't want to spoil it for you either. I thought this book was incredibly creepy in the way that it described the dragon. The dragon character is very scary and really freaked me out when I read this book initially, but I really liked Georgia as a protagonist as well. I do want to mention that this book, as the title may suggest, does carry the content warning for drug abuse, because Georgia is a drug addict, and that is a significant part of her backstory and kind of the setup for how she's gotten where she is now. So do know that going in, but I thought this was a really fun story, and again, the dragon was super creepy. Actually, the next two I want to recommend are also urban fantasy stories that are kind of spooky. So the first one is The Library of the Dead by T.L. Huchu. I just smacked myself in the face with that one. This is the first book in the Edinburgh Nights series, and it follows Ropa Moyo, who is a ghost talker, so she delivers messages for ghosts. And she does this full time so that she can try and earn enough money to provide for herself, her grandmother, and her little sister. But as a part of that, she gets drawn into an investigation when she meets a ghost whose son went missing before she died, and the ghost wants to know what happened to him. So Ropa has to kind of embark on this investigation to figure out what happened to this little kid. And along the way, she develops a little friend group that's very cute with her and Jomo and Priya, and they're all really fun characters. I thought this story was really fun. I really like the magic system in here. It's really interesting because Ropa uses a mabiri, I think, for her magic, which is like a hand piano kind of instrument. And I thought that was a really fun way of doing the ghost talking. I don't know, I just thought it was a really fun magic system, and I really enjoy Ropa's perspective throughout the book. I think she has a really fun and interesting perspective on the world. And then this last book is Strange Practice by Vivian Shaw. Again, it's an urban fantasy, but this one follows Dr. Greta Helsing, who is a doctor for the monsters and undead of London, and she gets drawn into a murder mystery investigation and investigating a serial killer when a vampire shows up having been gravely wounded, and she realizes that there's connections to a serial killer currently causing havoc amongst the human population. And so she's investigating to prevent any more of her patients from turning up injured or dead. I really enjoyed the way that Greta goes about solving this because she's very practical, she's very competent, but she also doesn't have to do everything alone because she has a really delightful found family in this story as well. So she's getting help from her friends Cranswell and Ruthven and this other guy whose name I can't currently remember. And so all of these characters are kind of helping her, and they all have different strengths, and I like the way that they kind of came together and had this little found family group and really leaned on each other for their different strengths. So I thought this was a really fun blend of really cozy found family elements with really creepy horror elements. But those are all of the spooky books I have for you today, and I hope that one of these has sparked your interest. I think they're all wonderful, and I think all of them are relatively quick reads, so if you wanted to kind of slip a few of these in right here at the end of the month, I think that's doable. They're all books that I got through pretty quickly at least, and I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you did, I hope you'll consider giving it a like, and maybe even subscribing to see what happens next, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.